The council chamber floated in the void between stars, a crystalline structure that had witnessed 10,000 years of galactic peace. Ambassador Thexanar of the Collective stood before the assembled representatives, his luminescent skin dimming with each passing moment as he delivered the words no one wanted to hear. The scourge had broken through the outer rim defenses. 3 civilizations had gone dark in the span of a solar rotation. The mathematical projections were undeniable now, scrolling across holographic displays in cold, merciless numbers. They had 6 cycles, perhaps 7, before the wave of extinction reached the core worlds. Every military stratagem had been exhausted. Every weapon in their considerable arsenal had proven insufficient. The scourge adapted, evolved, consumed. It was a force of nature given malevolent purpose, and it was winning. The chamber fell silent as Thexanar's words hung in the recycled air. Around the circular table, beings who had evolved beyond the need for violence, who had built their civilizations on logic and enlightenment, who had spent millennia pruning away the barbaric impulses of their ancestors, now faced the unthinkable. The Vexian delegate, her consciousness distributed across 17 interconnected nodes, spoke first, her voice harmonizing in frequencies that translated to reluctance tinged with desperation. She reminded the assembly of Protocol Omega, the contingency that had been drafted 3 centuries ago and immediately sealed, deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable to ever implement. The mere mention of it caused a ripple of unease through the chamber. The Chulati representative, encased in his methane-filled suit, released a chemical signature that everyone's translators interpreted as profound dread. They had all read the classified reports. They knew what Protocol Omega entailed. In the early days of the Galactic Collective, when the great civilizations first made contact and began sharing their histories, they had discovered something disturbing about one particular species from a small blue world in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. Humans, they called themselves. A species that had somehow achieved spaceflight despite spending most of their recorded history engaged in increasingly creative forms of mutual destruction. The psychological evaluations had been concerning. Where other species had evolved past their violent phases through natural selection and social development, humans had simply become more efficient at channeling their aggression. They had reached the stars not because they had transcended their nature, but because they had learned to aim it outward. The collective had made first contact with Earth just as humanity stood on the brink of either enlightenment or self-annihilation, and in an act of what they believed was mercy, had offered an alternative. The quarantine protocols were established with unanimous approval. Humanity would be contained, studied, and gradually uplifted through careful cultural exchange and genetic modification. Their aggressive tendencies would be managed through therapeutic intervention and social engineering. Within a few generations, they would join the collective as full members, their dangerous impulses safely domesticated. That was the plan. That was 300 years ago. The quarantine zone around Earth and its handful of colony worlds had held perfectly. Humanity had been given limited technology, enough to thrive, but not enough to threaten. The collective's observation posts had dutifully filed their reports, noting with satisfaction that human violence had indeed decreased under their guidance. The project was deemed a success, a model for how to civilize a dangerous species without resorting to elimination. But Protocol Omega told a different story. It was based on the original first contact assessments, the raw, unfiltered data that had been carefully edited out of the official histories. It contained interviews with human soldiers, analysis of their military doctrines, psychological profiles that made even the collective's most hardened xenobiologists uncomfortable. The humans didn't just fight. They excelled at it in ways that defied the collective's understanding of rational behavior. They formed emotional attachments to their comrades that overrode survival instincts. They created elaborate codes of honor around the act of killing. They wrote poetry about war, sang songs about battles lost and won, built monuments to the dead that became centers of cultural identity. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to derive a sense of meaning from conflict, as if struggle and sacrifice were fundamental to their concept of purpose. The debate raged for hours as cycles burned away. The ethical implications were staggering. To unleash humanity would be to admit that the collective's most fundamental principles had failed. It would validate the very barbarism they had spent millennia trying to transcend. But the alternative was extinction, not just for themselves, but for every civilization under their protection. The Chulati representative posed the question that hung unspoken in everyone's mind. What made them believe that humans, contained and softened by 3 centuries of peace, would even be capable of what the ancient reports suggested? Perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps humanity had truly been uplifted, their edge dulled, their fire banked. Perhaps there was nothing left to unleash. Thexanar touched his console, and a new hologram materialized at the center of the chamber. It showed a detention facility on one of the quarantine worlds, a place where humans who proved too resistant to the collective civilizing influence were housed. The recording was from 2 cycles ago. A malfunction in the containment systems had allowed several human prisoners to escape into the facility's lower levels, where maintenance drones were stored. What happened next, over the course of 18 hours, defied every statistical model the collective possessed. With nothing but improvised weapons and their bare hands, 47 humans had fought their way through 700 automated defense systems. Not fled. Not surrendered. Fought. The efficiency was terrifying. The coordination was perfect. The absolute refusal to stop, even when wounded, even when the rational choice was to submit, spoke to something that the collective had never truly understood. These weren't the uplifted, peaceful humans of the official reports. These were the creatures from the old files, and 300 years of civilization hadn't changed them one bit. The vote was
situation is critical. Deploy all available forces immediately. Yes, sir. Mobilizing now.
Understood. Standing by. With a gesture that felt like a betrayal of everything they believed in. Protocol Omega was approved by the narrowest margin in the Council's history, and even those who voted in favor did so with what could only be described as existential shame. Thexanar was designated as primary contact, a duty he accepted with the weight of species survival pressing down on his consciousness. The message was prepared with excruciating care, every word analyzed for implications, every phrase tested against human psychological profiles that were 3 centuries old and possibly obsolete. They would offer humanity a choice, frame it as partnership rather than desperation, though everyone in the chamber knew the truth. They were opening a cage they had built, asking the creatures inside to save them from the consequences of their own philosophical hubris. The transmission reached Earth on a frequency that hadn't been used since the quarantine began. In the capital city of the unified human government, alarms that had been silent for generations suddenly screamed to life. President Sarachin stood in the communication center, surrounded by advisors who had only read about first contact in history texts, watching as the face of Ambassador Thexanar materialized on screens that humanity had been forbidden to use for interstellar communication. His words were carefully chosen, his tone calibrated to convey respect and urgency in equal measure. The collective faced an existential threat. Their defenses had failed. Their warriors, such as they were, had proven insufficient. They required assistance from those with specialized capabilities. In exchange for humanity's help, the quarantine would be lifted. Full collective membership. Access to technologies that had been withheld. A seat at the table of galactic civilization. The president listened without interruption, her face betraying nothing of the storm of emotions beneath. When Thexanar finished, she asked for 24 hours to consult with her people. The ambassador agreed, though his dimming luminescence betrayed his anxiety. Every hour brought the scourge closer to the core worlds. But Chen understood something that the collective, for all their wisdom, had failed to grasp. You don't ask humans to fight for you. You ask them to fight for something. She needed time to make sure they understood what they were really being asked to do. The transmission ended, and the communication center erupted in controlled chaos. Ministers and military officials shouted over each other, but Chen raised her hand for silence. She made 3 calls in quick succession. The first was to Fleet Admiral Marcus Webb, head of the defense forces that had spent 3 centuries training for a war that never came. The second was to Dr. James Okonkwo, director of the Historical Archive, the repository of everything humanity had been before the collective tried to make them something else. The third was to her grandmother, retired General Maria Chen, who had fought in the last conflict before the quarantine, a woman who remembered what humans were capable of when given a cause worth dying for. They met in the archive, surrounded by artifacts from humanity's violent past. Ancient weapons hung on walls beside paintings of battles that had shaped civilizations. Books written by warriors and philosophers lined shelves, their words preserved even as the collective had tried to make them obsolete. General Chen, now well past her 100th year but still sharp-eyed and straight-backed, walked slowly through the collection, touching items with a reverence that made the others uncomfortable. She spoke of things they had learned not to discuss, the warrior traditions that every human culture had developed independently, the universal drive to protect tribe and territory that had manifested in 10,000 different forms across their history. The collective had seen it as a flaw to be corrected. They had tried to edit it out through education and genetic tweaking, to replace it with logic and pacifism. But you couldn't edit out what was woven into the core of a species. Admiral Webb pulled up classified reports from the quarantine period, surveillance data the collective had collected and humanity had secretly accessed decades ago. They showed the truth behind the peaceful facade. Human crime rates had indeed decreased, but the nature of crimes had shifted. Underground fighting rings operated in every major city. Virtual reality simulations of historical battles were the most popular form of entertainment. Young people joined expedition forces to the edges of the quarantine zone, seeking danger in the empty spaces between worlds. The collective's observers had noted these things with concern, recommending increased therapeutic interventions. They had completely missed the point. Humanity hadn't become peaceful. They had become bored. 300 years of enforced tranquility had simply compressed the spring tighter, and now the collective was about to release it. Dr. Okonkwo activated a holographic display showing demographic data that painted a troubling picture. Birth rates within the quarantine had fallen dramatically over the past century. Depression and anxiety disorders, once declining under collective guidance, had rebounded to pre-contact levels. Suicide rates were climbing despite access to advanced mental health technologies. The psychological reports all pointed to the same conclusion. Humans needed purpose and peace, while comfortable wasn't enough. They needed something to strive against, challenges that tested them, stakes that mattered. The collective had given them safety and comfort, and in doing so, had created a generation that felt empty. President Chen absorbed all of this, her strategic mind assembling pieces into a pattern. The collective's offer wasn't just an opportunity. It was a necessity for both species. They needed humanity's capacity for violence. Humanity needed the collective's cause. The president addressed the world at night. Her speech carried on every channel, translated into every language. She didn't hide the truth. She didn't soften the implications. The collective had kept humanity in a cage because they feared what humans were capable of. Now they needed those capabilities, needed them desperately enough to set aside 3 centuries of policy and pride. She spoke of ancestors who had fought and died for causes they believed in, of the warrior traditions that every culture had honored, of the fundamental human drive to stand against the darkness not because it was logical, but because it was right. The collective was asking them to be what they had always been, what no amount of social engineering could erase. The question was simple. Would humanity answer the call? The response was overwhelming and immediate. Military recruitment centers, vestigial institutions that had processed maybe a dozen applicants a year, were flooded with volunteers. The quarantine had produced 3 generations of humans who had grown up on stories of what their grandparents could do, raised on histories that the collective had tried to suppress but couldn't quite eliminate. They had trained in simulation and sport, channeled their instincts into games and competitions, waiting for something that mattered. Now they had it. Within 48 hours, President Chin transmitted humanity's response to Ambassador Thex and AR. They would help, but not as mercenaries or subordinates. As equals. Full collective membership, immediate and unconditional. Complete access to technology and intelligence. And humanity would prosecute the war their way, without interference or oversight. The collective could accept these terms, or face the scourge alone. Thex and AR sat in his private chamber aboard the council ship, staring at humanity's terms, with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Around him, the other representatives engaged in heated debate through quantum-entangled channels, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and pragmatism. The Vexian delegate argued passionately against giving humans unrestricted access to collective technology, painting dire scenarios of what could happen once the scourge was defeated and humanity turned their weapons inward. The Chulati representative, ever cautious, suggested modifications to the terms, limits and safeguards that might preserve some measure of control. But the mathematics were clear. The scourge had just consumed the tertiary hub, a population center of 17 billion souls, reducing it to scattered atoms in less than a standard day. Time was a luxury they no longer possessed. The vote came swiftly, forced by necessity rather than consensus. The terms were accepted in full, with the understanding that they were making a deal with a force they had never truly understood and might not be able to contain. Thex and AR transmitted the acceptance and waited, wondering what horrors they had just unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The response from Earth came within hours, along with something unexpected. A data packet containing detailed human military doctrine, strategic frameworks, and tactical methodologies developed over 10,000 years of almost continuous warfare. It was a gift and a warning. This was what humans did. This was what they were offering. The collective's military advisors, beings who had studied conflict from a theoretical perspective, opened the files and found themselves looking into an abyss of creativity applied to destruction that made their advanced minds recoil. The human approach to warfare was nothing like the collective's defensive strategies. Where the collective built shields and calculated optimal retreat vectors, humans built weapons with names like Planet Cracker and Atmosphere Incinerator, then locked them away with strict protocols against ever using them, not because they couldn't build them, but because they knew they would work too well. Their tactical manuals didn't just cover engagement scenarios. They detailed psychological warfare, resource denial, scorched earth policies, and strategies designed not just to defeat an enemy but to break their will to continue fighting. There were chapters on fighting while outnumbered, fighting while surrounded, fighting when all hope was lost, as if the concept of surrender was merely one option among many rather than the logical conclusion to unfavorable odds. Most disturbing were the sections on sacrifice, on acceptable losses, on the cold calculus of trading lives for objectives. The collective's warfare had always been about preservation. Human warfare was about winning, and the price was whatever it took. Fleet Admiral Webb arrived at the council ship with an advanced team of military strategists and engineers, the first humans to leave the quarantine zone in 3 centuries. The XNR met them in the diplomatic bay, prepared for aggression or resentment, braced for humans eager to settle old grievances. What he encountered instead was professionalism that bordered on the ceremonial. Webb was a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen combat in the simulation wars that humanity had waged against itself to keep their skills sharp. She saluted Thex and Ar with precise military formality, then immediately requested access to all intelligence on the Scourge, every engagement report, every sensor reading, every scrap of data the collective had accumulated. There was no time for pleasantries. Her people were already setting up command centers, interfacing human systems with collective networks, transforming entire sections of the ship into something that looked less like a diplomatic vessel and more like a warship preparing for battle. The briefing lasted 14 hours straight. Human officers absorbed information at a rate that surprised the collective's observers, asking questions that cut to the heart of tactical realities the collective had been dancing around. Why had they engaged the Scourge at maximum range when close-quarters fighting would negate the enemy's numerical advantage? Why hadn't they targeted supply lines and resource-gathering operations instead of attempting direct confrontation? Why were their defensive positions built for optimal survival rather than optimal damage output? Each question revealed a fundamental difference in philosophy. The collective fought to endure. Humans fought to destroy. Webb listened to the accounts of failed battles with an expression that Thex and Ar's translator struggled to interpret. Frustration, certainly. Anger, perhaps. But also something else. Recognition. The Scourge fought like a force of nature, overwhelming through sheer mass and relentless pressure. The collective had tried to weather the storm. Humans understood that you don't survive a storm. You break it before it breaks you. The first human fleet launched from Earth 72 hours after the terms were accepted, a mobilization that would have taken the collective months to organize. They weren't the massive dreadnoughts that the collective favored, ships designed to take punishment and survive. Human vessels were smaller, faster, built around weapons systems that seemed disproportionately powerful for their size. The design philosophy was evident in every line. These ships weren't meant to endure sustained combat. They were meant to hit hard, hit fast, and if necessary, take the enemy with them. Each vessel carried a crew that had volunteered knowing the odds, understanding that survival was secondary to mission completion. The collective's military observers watched the fleet depart with a mixture of awe and horror, seeing in those ships the crystallization of everything they had tried to evolve beyond. Webb established her command center on the front lines, at the edge of the Scourge's advance, where the collective's forces were preparing for yet another fighting retreat. She reviewed the defensive positions with growing dismay, then ordered them completely reorganized. The collective commanders protested. Her strategy would leave critical supply lines exposed, would sacrifice defensive depth for aggressive positioning. Webb listened to their objections with patience that was clearly forced, then explained in terms that left no room for argument. Defensive depth meant nothing when the enemy could simply flow around strong points. Supply lines were irrelevant if you weren't planning to be there long enough to need resupply. The human strategy was simple and terrifying in its implications. They would meet the Scourge head-on, engage at close range where the collective's superior technology couldn't be brought to bear, and either break the enemy's advance or die trying. There would be no retreat, no fallback positions, no plan B. They would hold or they would fall, and in either case, they would make the Scourge pay for every meter of space and blood and fire. The collective soldiers, beings who had been trained to minimize casualties and preserve force strength, watched as human troops deployed with an eagerness that seemed insane. These weren't the carefully managed, therapeutically adjusted humans of the quarantine. These were men and women who had spent their entire lives training for a war that had finally come, who viewed combat not as a tragic necessity, but as the ultimate test of everything they were. They checked their weapons with ritual precision, inscribed them with names and symbols that meant something only to them, and said goodbye to each other with a casualness that belied the fact that many of them wouldn't be coming back. The collective's observers filed reports describing behavior that ranged from concerning to incomprehensible. One human squad had engaged in what appeared to be some kind of group chanting before deployment, raising their voices in a song about death and glory that made the translators malfunction. Another had conducted a ceremony involving the burning of paper slips, each inscribed with names of ancestors who had died in ancient battles. These weren't soldiers in the collective's understanding. These were warriors, and there was a difference that 300 years of quarantine hadn't erased. The scourge came as it always did, a tide of biomechanical horror that had consumed a dozen civilizations and shown no sign of slowing. Sensors detected the advanced wave first, countless autonomous units that moved with insect-like coordination, adapting their formations in real time to counter whatever defensive measures they encountered. The collective's forces prepared for the usual pattern: initial contact, measured response, tactical withdrawal when casualties reached acceptable thresholds. But the humans had different plans. Webb waited until the scourge was committed, until their forward elements had moved past the point of easy retreat, then gave an order that made every collective commander's biosigns spike with alarm. All ships, full burn, directly into the center of the enemy formation. No evasive maneuvers. No preservation of combat strength. Just a headlong charge into the teeth of an enemy that had shattered every force sent against it. The scourge had adapted to collective tactics over dozens of engagements. It knew how to counter measured responses, how to absorb limited strikes and regenerate faster than the enemy could inflict lasting damage. But it had never encountered an enemy that didn't care about preservation, that viewed every ship and every life as ammunition to be expended in pursuit of victory. The human assault didn't slow when casualties mounted. It intensified. Damaged ships covered the advance of intact ones. Crews that lost their vessels transferred to boarding pods and turned themselves into missiles, punching through scourge hulls and fighting in the corridors with weapons that were designed for close-quarters butchery. The humans didn't just want to defeat the enemy. They wanted to make the enemy fear them, and in the cold calculus of their strategy, that meant showing the scourge something it had never seen before: prey that fought back not just to survive, but to kill. Admiral Webb coordinated the assault from her flagship, directing fleet movements with an intuition that seemed to bypass conscious calculation. She had studied the scourge patterns for 72 hours and come to a conclusion that the collective's analysts had missed. The scourge wasn't truly adaptive in the evolutionary sense. It was reactive, responding to threats with predetermined algorithms that had worked against every enemy it had encountered. But those algorithms assumed rational opponents, forces that valued their own survival enough to be predictable. Webb's strategy exploited that assumption mercilessly. She positioned her most damaged ships in patterns that looked like vulnerable retreats, then used them as bait to draw scourge forces into kill zones where human vessels waited in powered-down silence, invisible to sensors until they opened fire at point-blank range. The scourge would adapt, eventually. But eventually wasn't soon enough, and in the meantime, human tactics were teaching the enemy a lesson it had never needed to learn. Sometimes the wounded animal is more dangerous than the healthy one. The ground war was even more brutal. When scourge forces made planetfall on a contested world, expecting the usual pattern of civilian evacuation followed by defensive withdrawal, they instead encountered human infantry that had been waiting in prepared positions for days. The collective had never believed in holding ground against the scourge. The cost was too high, the outcome too uncertain. But humans had spent centuries studying defensive warfare on their own world, learning from every conflict in their bloody history. They knew how to build fortifications that channeled enemy advances into overlapping fields of fire. They knew how to use terrain as a weapon, collapsing tunnels and triggering avalanches at precisely calculated moments. Most importantly, they knew how to fight when surrounded, how to turn encirclement from a death sentence into an opportunity to ensure the enemy couldn't escape the kill zone either. The first major ground engagement lasted 36 hours of continuous combat. Scourge forces threw wave after wave of autonomous units at human positions, expecting the defenders to break when casualties reached critical levels. Instead, the humans dug deeper, fought harder, and when ammunition ran low, they fought with improvised weapons and their bare hands if necessary. Collective observers transmitted footage that would become both legendary and controversial in the years to come. One human squad, surrounded and cut off from resupply, held a strategic choke point for 14 hours after their heavy weapons failed. They used Scourge corpses as barricades, fashioned crude explosives from damaged enemy units, and when the position was finally relieved, only 3 of the original 12 were still standing, but the choke point had held. The Scourge had lost 400 units trying to take a position that by any rational calculation should have fallen in the first hour. But the true turning point came when the Scourge attempted its most devastating tactic, the strategy that had broken every civilization it had encountered. It began gathering mass for a final overwhelming assault, consolidating forces from 3 systems for a push that would sweep away all resistance through sheer numbers. The collective strategists watched the buildup with despair, calculating that no defensive position could withstand what was coming. Admiral Webb watched it with something else, opportunity. She pulled her forces back, appearing to retreat in the face of the Scourge's gathering strength, drawing the enemy into overextension. And then she revealed what humanity had been building in secret since they joined the war. Project Prometheus, a weapons platform that violated every treaty the Collective had ever signed because it was designed not to defeat an enemy but to annihilate them so completely that nothing remained. The Collective had banned weapons of mass destruction generations ago, believing that no tactical advantage was worth the moral cost. Humans had never signed those treaties. They had simply locked such weapons away with the understanding that some tools were too terrible to use except when the alternative was extinction. Webb gave the authorization personally, accepting the weight of the decision with the same calm she brought to every tactical choice. Project Prometheus activated in the heart of the Scourge gathering point, and for 3 seconds, an artificial star burned where the enemy fleet had been. When the light faded, there was nothing left but expanding spheres of plasma. 1/3 of the Scourge's total force ceased to exist in an instant, and the remaining units, for the first time in recorded history, retreated. Not withdrew in good order. Not repositioned for tactical advantage. Retreated in something that the Collective's analysts, reviewing the sensor data, could only describe as fear. The war didn't
All
end
wings
with
and
that
advanced
single
chase.
devastating
Engage
blow,
at full throttle.
but it
Copy,
changed.
flagship. Fleet is moving.
The Scourge had encountered something it couldn't adapt to, couldn't counter with algorithm and mass. It had met an enemy willing to pay any price, bear any burden, and if necessary, drag both sides into oblivion rather than accept defeat. Over the following months, human-led forces pushed back the Scourge advanced system by system, planet by planet, using tactics that made the Collective's military historians revise their understanding of what warfare could be. The humans didn't just fight. They innovated, creating new weapons and strategies in real time, turning every engagement into a laboratory for refining the art of destruction. They learned the Scourge's patterns faster than it could learn theirs, not because humans were more intelligent, but because they understood something fundamental about conflict that the Collective had forgotten. War wasn't a science to be optimized. It was an art to be practiced, and humanity had 10,000 years of practice. The cost was staggering. Human casualties ran 10 times higher than collective losses in comparable engagements. Entire fleets were reduced to debris fields. Ground forces suffered attrition rates that would have broken any other species' will to continue. But humanity had made peace with loss in ways the collective never could. Every human culture had rituals for honoring the dead, traditions that turned grief into resolve rather than despair. They built monuments on conquered worlds, not just to remember the fallen, but to mark the ground that had been purchased with their blood. The collective psychologists studied this behavior with a mixture of fascination and horror, unable to comprehend a species that could sustain such losses without collapsing into trauma and abandonment of the cause. The answer, when they finally understood it, was both simple and profound. Humans didn't fight in spite of the cost. They fought because the cost made it matter. Admiral Webb became something of a legend among both species, though the stories told about her differed dramatically depending on who was telling them. To humans, she was the embodiment of warrior virtue, a leader who had never asked her troops to take risks she wouldn't accept herself, who had walked the decks of damaged ships and stood in trenches with infantry, who had made the hard choices and borne the weight of them without complaint. To the collective, she was a reminder of everything they had tried to evolve beyond, a creature of controlled violence and calculated brutality who represented the failure of their grand civilizing project. When she finally stood before the council to deliver her strategic assessment, Thexanar found himself confronting the uncomfortable truth that both perspectives were accurate. Webb was exactly what humanity had always been. Dangerous, pragmatic, and absolutely committed to survival at any cost. The final push into Scourge-controlled territory was a campaign that would be studied for generations, not because of its tactical brilliance, but because of what it revealed about the fundamental difference between collective and human warfare. The collective had always assumed that the Scourge's home territory, wherever it might be, would be impregnable, protected by defenses so sophisticated that any assault would be suicidal. Webb's strategy was elegantly simple. If the assault was suicidal anyway, then that removed any reason for restraint. The human fleet that entered the Scourge's core systems carried every weapon humanity had ever conceived, including several that the collective hadn't known existed because they had been deemed too horrible to use. The orders were clear. Total war. No quarter asked or given. The complete and utter annihilation of the Scourge's capability to threaten anyone ever again. What they found in those core systems shook both species' understanding of the conflict. The Scourge wasn't a malevolent intelligence. It was a defense mechanism, an automated system created by a long-dead civilization to protect against external threats, corrupted by time and isolation into viewing all life as hostile. The collective's first instinct was to attempt communication, to see if the Scourge could be reasoned with or reprogrammed. Webb's response was blunt and uncompromising. The Scourge's origins didn't change what it had done, the civilizations it had consumed, the billions it had killed. Intent might matter in philosophy, but in war, only capability mattered, and the Scourge's capability for destruction remained unchanged. The assault proceeded as planned, human forces tearing through automated defenses with a systematic thoroughness that left nothing functional in their wake. When it was over, when the last Scourge installation had been reduced to molten metal, the galaxy was finally quiet. The peace that followed was complicated and uncomfortable. The collective had to confront the reality that their survival had been purchased by embracing the very principles they had spent millennia rejecting. Humans, meanwhile, found themselves in a galaxy that viewed them with a mixture of gratitude and terror, saviors who might become conquerors if the mood struck them. President Chen addressed both concerns in a speech delivered to a packed council chamber, with a candor that was characteristically human. She acknowledged what humanity was, what they had always been. A species born in violence, shaped by conflict, carrying within them the capacity for terrible destruction. But also a species that understood the weight of that capacity, that had learned through bitter experience that strength without restraint led to ruins. The collective had tried to change humanity through isolation and social engineering, to sand away their dangerous edges. They had failed, and in that failure, they had accidentally preserved something valuable. Humans who understood what they were capable of, and chose to control it. The treaty that formalized humanity's place in the collective was unlike any that had been drafted before. Humans would have full membership, full access to technology and resources, but they would also accept a burden that no other species wanted. They would be the collective's warriors, the force of last resort when peace failed and survival demanded violence. It was a role that played to humanity's strengths while acknowledging the collective's hopes for a better future. The peace would be kept by beings who had evolved beyond violence. But when that peace failed, as it inevitably would somewhere in the vast galaxy, humanity would be ready. Not because they wanted war, but because they understood that the price of peace was the willingness to fight for it. The galaxy would be protected by those who knew the cost of protection, who had paid it before, and would pay it again if necessary. Admiral Webb retired to Earth, her service record classified at the highest levels, her legacy debated in academic circles and military academies across 100 worlds. She spent her final years writing, not a memoir of the war, but a meditation on the nature of violence and civilization. Her conclusion, delivered in prose that was surprisingly philosophical for a career soldier, was that the collective had been right to fear humanity's capacity for destruction. But they had been wrong to think that capacity could be eliminated without destroying what made humans human. The trick wasn't to breed the warrior out of the species. It was to give the warrior a cause worth fighting for, and the wisdom to know when to sheathe the sword. The collective had given humanity that cause. Humanity had taught the collective that some things were worth the price of defending them. Years later, when the next crisis emerged, when some new threat appeared on the edge of known space, it was a human fleet that deployed first, carrying with them the lessons learned in blood and fire. The collective watched them go with mixed emotions, grateful for the protection but aware of the irony. They had quarantined humanity to keep them from becoming a threat to galactic peace. In the end, humanity had become the guarantors of that peace, not through transformation into something else, but by being exactly what they had always been: dangerous, determined, and ultimately decent. The galaxy was safer because the collective had finally learned what humanity had always known. Sometimes the last resort is the only resort that matters, and when the darkness comes, you don't need philosophers or diplomats. You need warriors willing to stand in the gap, to pay the price that peace demands, to be the sword that protects those who have chosen to live without them. The memorial on Earth's moon bore a simple inscription, visible from orbit, carved in letters a kilometer high. It listed no names, gave no glory to individual deeds, made no grand claims about the righteousness of the cause. It simply stated what every human who fought already knew. We were called. We answered. We paid the price. Remember why. And across the galaxy, in 1,000 different languages, on 100 different worlds, the collective did remember. They remembered that when all else failed, when logic and diplomacy and defensive warfare proved insufficient, when the choice came down to survival or extinction, the humans had stepped forward. Not because they were forced to, not because they had no other options, but because somewhere in the violent heart of their species was the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, and some prices were worth paying. The last resort had become the first hope, and the galaxy was forever changed by it.